Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully everyone's still with us after the short break. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker here at Guadec now, Joshua Simmons. Josh is a senior open source strategist at Salesforce and has done many different things in his career. So he's a short stack developer, and a really dedicated advocate of sort of open culture, inclusive community building, and sort of ethical technology. He's a freelancer and a former startup CEO, and I know he's worked as a volunteer and a professional community organizer. And since I think 2016, Josh has been on the board of the Open Source Initiative, and he's currently their president as well. And so, yes, as mentioned, he does open source strategy for Salesforce. And so it's delighted that we'll be able to introduce Josh and say it's over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neil. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I will warn you now, we may have cat interruptions as part of this keynote. That would be a nice feature if we did. The cat is just off screen here. All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As Neil mentioned, I've got a background in web development and volunteer and professional community organizing. I do open source strategy for Salesforce, and I'm now in my 5th year on the board of the Open Source Initiative and serving as its president currently. I don't like to assume that folks are familiar with the Open Source Initiative, though. So I will just say that OSI is the nonprofit founded in 1998 that stewards the open source definition in the OSI approved license list. So as a result of that, admittedly, I spend a lot of time thinking about licensing. Too much, honestly, but it's my job. I'm here today to share why licensing shouldn't be something that we think about very much. Because I also think about injustice and inequity a lot, especially these days. Not enough, honestly, and it's my responsibility to think about it. I don't think that more licenses will get us any closer to realizing the as yet unfulfilled promises of user freedom, nor justice, nor equity, nor a restoration of our climate and ecosystems. That's what we're going to talk about today. If I could set the scene a little bit, this is an extraordinarily abbreviated history. In about 1987, we got the free software definition. About 10 years later, we ended up with the Debian free software guidelines. And just 1 year later, we ended up with the open source definition, the 10-point definition. I believe it was 9 points initially, but the now 10-point definition that we use to judge whether a license is considered open source or not. There are a lot of narratives here. There are many competing and complementary narratives. There's a free software centered narrative. Software freedom is a moral movement, and open source is about business. That might be true. There's an author-centered narrative. Maintainers are exploited and deserve more support. And maybe we should consider new licenses to make sure that they get paid. There's a user-centered narrative. Vanishingly few people have had the promise of user freedom realized for them. There are narratives that claim free software and open source are libertarian ideals that are unfit for the world we live in. And there are narratives that suggest that free software and open source can be viewed through more socialist and communitarian lenses. There are narratives from people out there doing the work to educate every last human on this planet, or coordinate crisis response, or provide accessible, self-service infrastructure for underserved people. Narratives that suggest that, you know what we've got is working. And I got to be honest, I can't offer a definitive narrative. I don't have one. And I think there's some validity to all of these. What I do know is that I used and benefited from free and open source software for about 18 years before I even realized that something special was happening. It's a little embarrassing to say that and admit that in retrospect. I totally took it for granted. You know, I built a freelance career on selling a Drupal. You know, it took me till 2013 when I realized that, oh my gosh, this is not usually how things work. This is something special. In 2013, when I discovered the free software movement and not just software that was free, when I discovered the philosophies behind open source, I was ecstatic. When I met the people and communities that made it happen, I fell in love. Mostly, we've got some work to do. You know, I've long had an intuitive love of the commons, a distaste of intellectual property systems that are twisted by special interests. I mean, the copyright now lasts for what, 75 plus years in the US. It was not intended to function that way, and it's not in the interest of the public. I also have a natural tendency to get involved with communities. And so working and volunteering in free and open source software, it's at the intersection of so many things that I love. And so I dove in headfirst when I first encountered this world. Admittedly, it helped that I had landed a job as community manager for OSCON. And I was welcomed with open arms, both because I'm a kind, caring, curious, presumably talented human being, but also no doubt because I'm a straight passing white guy born in the San Francisco Bay Area. I am the very image of privilege, and that's not lost on me. That's not at all lost on me. So 7 years later, I'm president of the Open Source Initiative and a senior open source strategist at Salesforce. It's an honor, it's a privilege, and I know that I'm doing meaningful work, denting the world in lots of little but very positive ways. But I don't know about you. I can only speak for myself. I know that I'm not satisfied. I'm personally fine, right? Beyond fine, except for the ways in which that's not true for anyone else, me or anyone else in the United States right now. I'm not wanting for me, but this global political moment demands more of me. The climate crisis demands more of me. Equity and justice for all demand more of me. Every minute of suffering and every life lost to injustice demands more of me. The memory of all those who fought to make ours a better world, the sacrifices of our elders and our peers who fight to make our world a better place, all of that demands more of me. Do you feel that too? I bet you do. Even if, also like me, you're really not sure what more you have to give. If you already feel tapped out, exhausted, maybe even desperate and fatalistic. I could shift gears for a moment here. Free and open source software is more prevalent than ever. It is mainstream. Certainly open source is, if not free software. The common threads that bind it have always been tested from the very beginning and subsequently refined, which is a very positive thing. But now that free and open source software is so big, and so is the challenge of the moment, and the pace of change grows only ever more rapid, the testing of the four freedoms and the open source definition has hit a fever pitch. From the beginning of these experiments in licensing that brought us free software and open source, We've seen motivated experimentation. We've seen experimentation in licenses motivated by changes in technology. For instance, the Affero GPL to close the SaaS loophole as that became a more common way of doing business for tech companies. Or the cryptographic autonomy license, which is in response to widespread concerns around data ownership and privacy. We've also had motivated experimentation driven by money. Of course we have. There's the shared source initiative. There are source available licenses. There's whatever you call the commons clause. There's also experimentation that's motivated, that's coming from a place that is very near and dear to my heart and probably near and dear to your heart, because ultimately this movement sprung out of a set of morals, out of a set of ethics, out of a set of values. We see a lot of experimentation driven by ethics and a want for a better world. Early on, and this is not the earliest example, but early on we have the JSON license saying, this software shall be used to do good, not evil. More recently, we had someone craft the vaccine license. Didn't get OSI approval. That won't surprise anybody. But it's a license that is open source-ish, provided that people are vaccinating themselves. Laudable goals, I guess. I want public health too. And most recently, we've seen the Hippocratic license and the ethical source working group spin up, experimenting with licenses to dissuade the violation of human rights and to move the needle on a number of social issues. And this is good. Don't get me wrong. Given my role, I have a stake in a certain version of reality. I recognize that. But we need experimentation. Experimentation is what brings us forward. That testing of our ideals and our definitions is what brings us into the future and what refines the principles on which we operate. So I'm glad people are experimenting. Why wouldn't I be? I'm sympathetic to the experiments driven for a desire for justice. The evolution of licenses in the face of changing technology, well, it seems inevitable and necessary. The experimentation in pursuit of greater profits, well, it's understandable, if not particularly interesting or sympathetic. The common thread is that people see needs and they're trying to meet them. That's great. To a point. Given the jobs that I hold, you're probably not surprised to learn that I'm perennially concerned about license proliferation. This is one of my applications. But why are we talking about licenses again? What was all that about the climate crisis and injustice demanding more of us? Why are we focusing on licenses so much? That's something, even in my job, I find myself asking often. While we haven't yet realized the promise of software freedom, we certainly have of open source. We've succeeded more or less at hacking around copyright systems to make it easier to share and collaborate. At this point, licensing is more or less a solved problem in need of only occasional updates. Sidebar, let's not forget to keep working toward copyright reform. That's still broken. But in the face of climate crisis, of injustice, copyright licenses may have a small role to play, but honestly, when I hear about licenses designed to dissuade human rights violations, I both laud the effort and agree with the goal, while believing that this experimentation is a tiny optimization at the edges of a huge problem. An optimization that requires a lot of work without offering any assurances that it'll be effective. We really just don't know. Now, far be it from me to discourage people from trying to use what they know to make the world a better place. That's great, good on them. For myself, personally, I'm taking a different tack. I am, for myself, decentering the tech industry and our movement and reaching for proven tools to affect societal change. Because to me, if I may invoke the words of the unparalleled Karen Sandler, software freedom is in service of human rights. To me, software freedom and the ideal of user freedom is a necessary part of building a more just and equitable world. Free and open source software is necessary, but it's insufficient. And that's the thesis of this talk. What I would like to do is to have a bit of a conversation with everybody today. Because I think we share an appreciation of the fact that ours is a moral movement. User freedom, giving people autonomy, control over the devices that they operate, visibility into the software and machinery that they're operating and how their data is being used, providing accountability, helping us be in control of our own lives and the things that we use rather than being beholden to large companies, even like the one I work for. We recognize that user freedom is such an important component of building a more just society. But we know that user freedom is not something that many people have. I really appreciate that the time that I spend around people like Karen Sandler and Bradley Kuhn, who live their values as well they should, with incredible dedication, who are still using G1 cell phones that are, I don't know how many years old now, but they're the only mobile phones that they can use that are mostly, if not completely, free and open source software. I really appreciate that there are people living their values like that. I also appreciate that they recognize that not all of us can do that. Not all of us can make those sacrifices. And certainly, people who don't have the privilege of spare time to figure out these systems, the privilege of having the technical skills and time to set up their systems, to avoid proprietary systems and centralized data ownership, things like that. I often have conversations when I'm around my peers in free software about how unrealistic it is to expect everybody to live that way. It's just not possible. But we need to make it possible, and that's the problem. That's the problem. We need to make changes to the way that we work so that everybody benefits from user freedom, that everybody has that promise fulfilled for them. Not just technologists, not just motivated geeks with spare time, but everybody, every last human on this planet should be a beneficiary of user freedom. And I think we probably all share that. And yet it feels like we're so far away from that. So what I would like to do with the remainder of my time with you here today is to share a few of the things that I've been thinking about that I think we need to work through to extend the promise of user freedom to everybody. And I'm gonna walk us through a discussion here, and I want you to know that you probably know better than I do. And I'm not an expert. I'm a community organizer. I'm good at listening. I'm good at synthesizing things. But no doubt there are things that you know that I don't know, that we should all know. that we can work on to make sure user freedom is something that we eventually extend to everybody on this planet. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through a few of the things that I've been thinking about. And there will be a few sort of sections for audience input, for you to be a part of the conversation. Because like I said, I don't know a lot. I just know what I know. And I want us together to come out of this session, out of this keynote, knowing more than we entered it, motivated to make user freedom an inclusive thing, and with a sense of the kinds of things we need to do to make that happen. So for starters, I want to talk about the internal work that we need to do, the work within our communities, within our projects to improve user freedom. This one, top of mind. Every single project. This is not new. I think the code of conduct pledge that a lot of speakers and projects were taking was 6 years ago now, 2014. And even then, codes of conduct weren't new. Today, a project having a code of conduct is table stakes, totally table stakes, just a baseline requirement. Because honestly, as someone who's done event planning, community organizing, my number one responsibility is safety. Because if I can't convene a community in a safe fashion, then inevitably the work that I am doing is incomplete because there are people who are excluded from it. And inevitably the work that I'm doing is exacerbating the inequity, the lack of representation, the other cultural issues that we know we have in our communities. So code of conduct, totally table stakes. By the way, don't roll your own code of conduct. There are professionals who do this thing. There are quality templates out there. There are some not so quality templates as well. But hire a professional. It's so worth it. And make sure that part of hiring a professional is not just establishing a code of conduct, but figuring out what the enforcement procedures are. Because frankly, a code of conduct absent enforcement procedures and the training to use them is arguably worse than no code of conduct at all. Because if somebody new to your project sees that you have a code of conduct, that is a signal. That is a signal that this is a place where I might be safer. This is a place where people are going to look after me, where there will be recourse if something poor happens to me. I don't know how many people here have been involved with code of conduct responses and teams, but I'm familiar with a few communities that propped up a code of conduct but did not have any enforcement procedures, did not have any training for the team members for how to handle incidents. And the consequences of that are that when somebody is harassed or made to feel unwelcome or unsafe, and they go to report it, the organizers don't even know what to do. And sometimes the organizers put a code of conduct there because people demanded it of them, but really their heart wasn't in it. They didn't really understand why they were doing it and what all the other obligations were associated with it. And in that situation, we have created the illusion of safety without actual safety. And that is a dangerous scenario for people who don't look like me, for underrepresented and underserved people, for marginalized voices. So every project, many do now, I hope most do, I don't know what the numbers look like, but every project as a table stakes ought to have a code of conduct and enforcement procedures. Along with that, strong moderation. One of the things that I've been known to say in the past is that your community is only as good as the worst behavior that it tolerates. Look, sometimes you can't help that somebody joins your community and behaves in a genuinely terrible fashion, either intentionally or not. That's going to happen. The measure of your community is how you respond when it does. So strong moderation is really, really key to setting the tone in a community and building an environment and a culture that is not just effective at producing quality software, but also welcoming and healthy and wholesome. Scholarships and mentorship, also so important. One of the things that I suspect most of us know about certainly the tech industry is that it has a diversity and inclusion problem. Not the only industry that does, but gosh, I feel like we have less of an excuse than most. We know better. And up until the 80s, we didn't have these problems in the same way. You know, at least not in terms of gender balance. Today, our industry is overwhelmingly white, male, straight. It's dominated by people who look like me. And even for somebody who, you know, benefits from the privilege of being in that majority, you know, that harms us all. That harms us all because we don't benefit from the perspectives that other people might bring when our industry is homogenous. And I feel that. Now, if the tech industry has a problem, free and open source software, the problem's even worse for us. You know, the few surveys I've seen done here, some flawed, all flawed to some degree, some pretty quality. All of them, every single last one of them suggests that we have a shocking, appalling problem with diversity and inclusion in free and open source software communities. And here's how I think about that. You know, while many of us, when we were growing up, going online was where we found our communities. You know, I know for me as a queer man, as a neurodivergent person, you know, I couldn't find many of my peers in the physical spaces around me. And so I found refuge online. I found my people online. I found safety. I found camaraderie. And that's part of what got me into this industry in the first place. I spent so much time on my computers. You learn some skills and surprise, suddenly you've got a career. I'm sure that I'm not the only one with a story of that shape. But though the internet was for me a refuge in the for the aspects of who I am that are not you know, the majority or the you know, the people in power. Today, free and open source software communities just don't reflect that diversity. And the way that I think about that is that participating in these communities requires free time. It requires me to have time after work, between caring for my parents or my siblings, or, you know, I don't have any kids, but, you know, I know other people who do have kids. You know, it's difficult to find the time when you're caring for your family, when you're working a job. Maybe you're working 2 jobs or 3 jobs. Maybe you have a disability that makes everything you do take that much more effort, that much more time. And so many people in this world are time poor and do not have the privilege of free time to participate in our communities. And so scholarships are an essential building block to correcting our communities, to making them more whole, more representative. Scholarships so that people can spend their time with without making sacrifices in caring for their parents or their children or their job. Scholarships so that people can learn these things and get paid while they're doing it. And mentorship so that they can have someone who is seasoned and experienced walking them through that process. I know my first contribution to open source was a terrifying experience. Nobody else had ever had to look at my code or judge it. And having a mentor to help me through that first experience made the difference between making that contribution and not. And if that's the case for me as a white man from the Bay Area, think how much harder, think how much more necessary that mentorship is for people who don't have all the benefits that I do. So there are scholarships. The Python Software Foundation offers grants. Linux Australia offers grants. I know GNOME also has a grant program. And there's also the Outreachy program that does sort of paid internship / mentorship kind of situation. These are all fantastic programs. And we should strive to have every project participate in them so that those projects can bring in new life, new perspectives, skills that aren't yet represented within the project. We also need to make intentional efforts so that people are not only safe, are not only given a bridge into our communities, but we need to make sure that they feel heard, that they feel represented, that they feel welcome. That representation piece is important. If your project holds an event, a meetup, conference, online or otherwise, if your project has a about the maintainers page or about the contributors page, what does that look like? Who are you giving a platform? And do they look like me? Or do they look like underserved and underrepresented communities? I think it goes without saying that representation matters. And if you want to recruit more women, more non-binary people, more people of color, people who don't speak English as a first language, if you want to recruit these other people to your projects, well, then a really important way of making sure that they feel welcome and like there's a place for them in your project is by elevating and giving a platform to people who are in your project who are already like that. So even if your project maintainer is a white man or a white woman or what have you, try to find somebody else to empower. Try to give the microphone to somebody else. Try to mentor them and elevate them so that you can recruit more people like them. I also think that we need to be doing proactive outreach to recruit users as well as contributors to make sure that our user communities and contributor communities are reflective or representative of the demographics of the world around us. And representation looks different all around the world, but the common thread is that we need to make sure that our projects are, the demographics of our project communities are as much as possible reflective of the world, because frankly, how can we possibly extend the promise of user freedom to people if those very same people are not already a part of our community, if they're not already people that we're talking to, if they're not already people that we understand what their unique needs are? If I'm building software that doesn't support right to left text, well, I'm automatically shutting out lots of people. If my project, if my software doesn't support screen readers or accessibility, that's 10% of the population at least that I have just automatically excluded from ever participating in our community or benefiting from it. So we need to do really proactive outreach to these people to bring them in as users and as contributors, to listen to them. And the more that we do that, the more that the software we build will be useful for the whole world and can be a beachhead on which we work and build out to provide the promise of user freedom to people. Another key part of the internal work we need to do is we need to elevate designers, technical writers, community managers, other necessary skill sets. We put code on a pedestal in a way that I think is devastating. And I say that myself as someone who codes. Show me the code is such an insidious approach to evolving our communities. If someone comes to me with a concern or a bug or an issue, and I say, all right, go solve it, I'm just putting the onus right back on that person to do that work. And if we're talking about somebody who's a member of an underrepresented or disadvantaged group, if somebody who has who needs accessible technology and my project isn't accessible and they're making a report about how it's inaccessible, obviously, I would hope, obviously, it is not okay for me to say, okay, go fix it, show me the code. What I need to do is I need to go find the accessibility experts in my industry, in my surrounding communities, and I want to bring them into my project. And I want to help them get the work done. And I want to educate myself so I can help them get the work done as well. By putting code on a pedestal, we build projects that not only lock out contributors with other skill sets, but we build products and software that really caters to us because we're the ones who make it. I have tried to bring designers into projects, for instance. And I got to tell you, teaching a designer Git or how to use the command line interface, yeah, they can learn, but are those really the tools that, should we really be wasting their time on learning those tools, on meeting us where we are at? Or might we benefit from providing project infrastructure that meets them where they're at, so that designers can more readily be a part of our projects and design can be a stronger component of the software that we build? Same thing goes for technical writers and community managers. These are skills that are implicitly devalued because our documentation caters to developers, because our tools cater to developers, the user experience and the documentation, it all reflects that. And so there's a lot of work we need to do in bringing these people into our communities and learning about them and finding the ways that we can collaborate with them more effectively. Because if we don't, well, I don't know how we're providing anybody with user freedom if they can't use the software, if it's not usable, if it's not well designed. You know, so long as proprietary software excels in these things, we will always be playing catch up. So it's a little more on the internal work that we need to do. And this dovetails with that last point. Our tools, our documentation, our communication mediums, we need to be thinking about how we can use those things, what choices we're making, and how we can make choices that don't unduly center developers. I know that's going against the grain of decades of established practice, but mailing lists are not the end all be all of communication. And though I don't love the success of Slack, IRC is not really something that I can expect everybody to get on board with. Thank goodness for Rocket Chat and Matrix and Zulip and these free and open source alternatives to Slack. They're so much more usable and they're so important. And so I really want to laud the GNOME community for its use of Rocket Chat, because I think that's a fantastic way of you're making a choice there that is accessible to people that aren't developers. So we need to be intentional about the choices that we're making there and recognize how those influence the people who participate. And we need to have well-defined shared governance models. If there's no clear way for me to get involved with the project, not just say the contributing guide, but if there's not a clear way for me to move from someone who opens an issue to contributor to someone who has a commit bit to maintainer, well, then the hierarchy of that project, the way that project operates, it's going to reinforce the status quo. And the whole thesis of this talk is that the status quo is not acceptable. It's not okay. And so by having well-defined, explicitly documented shared governance models, we can provide a clear, bright path for people who are unlike us to become more involved and have more influence in our projects. I also think that aggressive succession planning and cultivating of new leaders is so important. And specifically doing that in search of people who don't look like me. So I have used my time differently than I thought I would. This slide suggests a moment where I would ask people for more input. And I'm going to ask for input, but I'm going to shuffle that toward the end in the proper Q&A bit here. Here is that list of things. Is it complete? No, it's not. But these are some of the things that are top of mind for me that I think are important for us to be working on. And I hope that some of these speak to you, and some of these are things that you yourselves can make a dent in. Now, a little bit, I really mean it, just a little bit about the external work that we need to do. Oh my goodness, we must prioritize accessibility, security, and usability in our projects from the outset. Now, many of you here are probably involved with projects who've been around for decades, or if not years, at least. And those of you who've been involved in building software probably know that all too often, accessibility, security, usability, it's far too common for those things to be shoehorned in at the end of a project. And there is just no way to do that effectively. These need to be top level priorities from the outset in any project. Otherwise, we are automatically excluding huge swaths of the population, further calcifying existing injustices in our world, further endangering vulnerable people, and further excluding people who don't have the privilege of free time to troubleshoot your project. We must prioritize these things. And this maybe is more of an indictment of the culture and the communities around where I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area than it is of the global community. But I bet that this will resonate with some people from other locales as well. It is far, far too common for our projects to be building for the cutting edge, for us to assume that, oh, everybody's got broadband and reliable internet, everybody's got heaps of memory, no big deal if it takes, I need to download 5 megabytes in the initial payload just to run this web page. Everybody's got a 23-inch monitor or 17-inch. These assumptions are wrong. And when we operate on these assumptions, when we do not question these assumptions from the very beginning, when we're building software, we are further excluding, frankly, most of the world. Even in industrialized nations with decent infrastructure, we are disenfranchising people when we build for the cutting edge rather than the last mile. And then lastly, on my mind, the external work we need to do, we need to be doing education and outreach to let users know that they can be more than just consumers. They can be participants. They don't have to be contributors. They don't have to contribute code or documentation or design. Anybody can participate. And we need to let them know about that. I'm on a civic engagement kick right now, really finding all the ways that I can get involved with my government at the local, regional, and at all the different levels to bend the systems towards justice and equity. And I think we've got to do the same thing within free and open source software communities. We need to allow people to simply be consumers if that's all they have the bandwidth for. But we need to proactively make sure that they know that they can be involved and that they actually have some ownership in these things, and that, this software is community owned and it's answerable to the community, and you are a part of that community. So come tell us what you think. Tell us where you're struggling with our software. And if we're lucky, some of them will become contributors. Again, is this exhaustive? Heavens no. No, this is just what's top of mind for me. And these are things that we need to do. Now, okay, I want to acknowledge that there's a broader context here that I mentioned early on in this talk. What about human rights? What about the climate crisis? I'm not an expert in those things. And so I'm not going to, pretend to be authoritative and to really have great guidance for us there. But as you know, I do believe the moment demands a lot more of us. And part of that means getting real about what it means to deliver user freedom and software freedom, to deliver the promise of user freedom in service of human rights. Like, yes, that is so important, but there's a much broader project here for us. So, I don't have a lot in the way of answers here, but I can tell you what I'm doing. I'm following the news. I'm listening to experts. I'm listening to marginalized voices. I am deliberately stacking my networks with people who are unlike me so that I can learn from them, learn about their concerns. Because when we lift up the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged people, all ships rise with that tide. I'm learning, and I'm educating my peers, because unfortunately, there are peers that I have who put a lot more stock in what I say than a person of color or a person of a different gender. And so I have a privilege, and it is my obligation to use that privilege to educate my peers. So that's what I'm doing. I'm writing my elected officials. I'm showing up at city council and commission meetings, which I don't know about how it is where you're at, but amid the pandemic, all of those things are taking place online now. I don't have to go to City Hall to participate. It's so much easier. I could be doing that over dinner. And so I do. I'm writing my elected officials. I'm showing up at meetings, and I'm providing material support for protesters and advocacy organizations, because, as somebody who works in the tech industry, who lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can make some pretty solid guesses about all the privileges that come with that. And I'll be damned if I don't spend my privilege to try to lift everybody else up. And not everybody has that. And not everybody can engage the way that I've been engaging. What it looks like is different for everybody. So I would just encourage us to be honest with ourselves about how far we have to go in extending the promise of user freedom to every last person on this planet, and to think about how that intersects with the broader struggle for equity and justice. And then let's get to work. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. And that is all I have for my presentation today. I think we have a little time for Q&A.
We do indeed, Josh. Thank you so much for a fantastic chat. Everyone seems to be loving it on the channels as well. A couple of questions where we don't have too much time, but I think we can overrun a little bit. So one is around code of conducts and the way people sort of interact with them. So one of the questions is, how do we deal with big and important projects that refuse to get a code of conduct? And again, sort of tied to that, is there some resources that we can use or some sort of discussion? How would you approach that with people who don't just see the use of a code of conduct?
Yeah. You know, I one of the things that I recognize is a challenge in the code of conduct conversation is that a lot of that conversation was, at least at the outset, was very centered on the United States. And you know, I think it's fair to say that there's a history of cultural imperialism coming out of the United States. And so people, you know, naturally have a tendency to resist that. And I think that's fair and merited. But what I like to say to people is that codes of conduct are about level setting. We all come from such varied backgrounds. What is professional in our eyes, you know, or what is acceptable in our eyes varies far more from individual to individual than I think any of us would care to admit. And so I see codes of conduct in terms of helping us be our best selves, put our best foot forward. And I think a lot of the resistance comes from, I don't think that we will ever have these problems, or, you know, we're all adults, you know, I think we all get it. Or oh, this is a punitive measure, and, you know, this is the thought police are out to get us, and suddenly, like, you know, we're gonna have all these problems in our community, and I'm not gonna be free to speak my mind. Those are all gross misrepresentations of what a code of conduct is and what it does. And for me, what I like to share with people is that a code of conduct, it tells us not just what isn't okay and what we should be careful about, but it tells us how we can be our best selves. You know, it codifies good ways of being as well. And what that does for all of us who come from such different backgrounds, that means that we are starting from the same baseline. And that is just going to make every single interaction we have so much easier. And frankly, even when a person does fall afoul of a code of conduct, you know, part of those enforcement trainings, those enforcement procedures, it tends to be a restorative justice model. You know, it tends to be like, hey, you know, this thing had this impact, and, you know, we're not sure what your intent here was, but this isn't okay, and we would like to help you do better. And some people don't respond that well to that. You know, there are legitimately bad actors sometimes, but most of us, we just make mistakes because we're human, and most of us, we want to learn. And so I just really encourage people to think about codes of conduct not as a punitive thing that can kill free speech or anything like that. No. It's a tool to make sure that we're operating from the same page, and that we're making sure people know that they are welcome welcome, and that there are procedures for sorting these things out when we are not on the same page. I'll just add really briefly, this would be a last resort, but I think a huge feature of the licensing, that the regime that that's been created through free software and open source, there is an option of last resort, forking. And frankly, if a project's leadership is not responsive to the needs of marginalized people, and they're not getting with the program in terms of evolving the community and the structures around it, well, I would say forking is a valid option at that point.
Yeah, just trying to keep up with Etherpad jumping all along the lines of it. Okay, could you talk maybe a little bit more about the work of a open source project manager and kind of what that looks like? The suggestion that maybe people will be more likely if there was a template for participation, like there is for writing or translating. I mean, for those like us who've been around this for long enough, it's like, we know what it is to be a maintainer. We know what it is to write code. We know what it is to do translations, and even bug triaging, that's known. But what is it that someone who's interested could do to help as a project manager, especially in a situation where with a lot of projects is entirely voluntary driven? So you can't tell people, no, you can't do that feature, you have to work on this feature instead, because they just won't.
Whew. Oh, that's a good question. I think one of the things that I'm working on right now is I've got this notion of accidental leadership. In this world in which we exist, a lot of us got here because we were scratching our own itch. We had a problem we needed to solve. Free software tools were the way to get that done. And lo and behold, suddenly I'm the maintainer of a new package or project. If I only did that to scratch my own itch, but I licensed it openly so that others can benefit from it, like, that's great. But maybe I didn't go into it with my eyes wide open as to what all the other obligations and responsibilities are that might arise from putting a project out in the open. And so right now I'm doing research with established projects and new projects to identify areas where we need to provide greater guidance and definition for things like building a project governance. How much governance is too much? How much is enough? What is just? What is fair? What is reasonable? These are tough questions. And a lot of work has been done in this area. But also, one of the things about being an accidental leader is it tends not to be an intentional thing, right? It tends to be like, oh, here I am. Oh, shoot. Now I need to know all these things and have these skills, and I don't have them, and help. Where do I go? And though there's lots of prior art out there, it's a lot to wade through. It is a lot to wade through. And so I'm sorry, I don't actually have a crisp answer here, other than to say, like, this is something that I'm working on because I recognize that it's a challenge, and I hope that we are going to be producing some open materials that people can read and benefit from to provide some clarity on matters like that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think we kind of run out of time, so it just remains for me to thank you again. I think it was a fantastic talk. Hopefully when all this global pandemic is over, we can meet up again over a beer and have a thoroughly loud agreement over every single thing that you said. So that would be absolutely fantastic.
I look forward to it.
That'd be great. So thank you very much, Josh. There's quite a lot of discussion in the chat as well over these things. So if you wanted to hang around and talk there, that's fine.